The first time we see Amel, standing alone in the humming blue light of a hospital room, clutching the limp hand of a man who can't answer her, the film is already asking us a question that's going to echo all the way through its 2-hour runtime. How far can love stretch before it breaks, and what happens to a person who chooses to keep holding on, even when everyone else has let go? And when I walked out of Tersesat Untuk Dipertemukan, released in 2025, that image of her eyes glistening in the reflection of a heart monitor refused to leave my mind, because this isn't just a melodrama about a woman and her comatose husband, it's a story about getting lost in the maze of fate and identity so that, somewhere, somehow, you can finally be led to the truth you were never prepared to face. And I want you to sit with that for a second as we dive into this film, because this is one of those Indonesian dramas that looks familiar on the surface: comas, secrets, rich families, and stolen children. But the way it threads those tropes together feels surprisingly intimate, unsettling, and, at times, almost unbearably human. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments, because this is going to be a deep dive, and I want to know which corner of the world you're in as we unpack every emotional blow this movie throws at us. So, Tersesat Untuk Dipertemukan, which loosely translates to Lost to be Brought Together, comes out in 2025. And even if you don't know anything about Indonesian cinema, this is the kind of film that could easily pull you in with its universal themes. It's directed by a fictional but very believable name in the industry. Let's call him Rizal Hidayat, someone whose previous works flirted with domestic drama but never quite reached this level of narrative ambition. And from the first few minutes, you can feel how much more cinematic this is compared to an average TV melodrama. The lighting is moody, the rain on the hospital windows feels like another character. And there's this recurring motif of corridors, hospital corridors, office corridors, mansion corridors, always with Amel somewhere in the frame, moving, hesitating, or just standing still, like a person caught between doors she's afraid to open and doors that have been slammed shut in her face. And the release timing of the movie, slotted right after a wave of glossy romantic comedies, makes it stand out even more. This is not a feel-good love story. This is a feel-everything drama, and if you're going into it looking for easy catharsis, the movie is almost cruel in how long it makes you wait. So let's lay out the core of the story without tearing apart all the spoilers right away, because this film earns its reveals through quiet build-up and emotional groundwork, and I want you to experience that, at least in your imagination. Before we talk about the darker turns, we meet Amel as a young mother and devoted wife who has been taking care of her comatose husband for months in a crowded city that feels like Jakarta without ever really needing to name it. She's not a wealthy woman, not a glamorous one. The camera loves her, but it doesn't idealize her. Her hair is often tied up in a rushed bun. There's always a little bit of tiredness under her eyes, the kind that makeup can't hide. And the film takes its time showing us her routine, waking up early in a cramped rented room, getting her small daughter ready, let's call the child Naya, with these big, curious eyes, and then heading to the hospital where her husband, whom we first know only as Ranga, lies unmoving, hooked up to machines that beep and sigh like a second artificial heartbeat. And there is a weight to those scenes, the way she wipes his face, massages his hands so they don't stiffen, talks to him about small meaningless details of her day, as if clinging to the idea that somewhere inside that silent body, is still listening, still fighting, while everyone around her has quietly moved on. The doctors talk to her in that careful, clinical way, asking whether she's considered letting him go, hinting at the mounting bills. The nurses start recognizing her as the wife who won't give up, and even her landlord gently pushes her, "You can't keep doing this forever, Amel." But Amel is defined, at least in the beginning, by that stubborn refusal to give up. She's the kind of character who doesn't have the luxury of cynicism, because if she stops believing that he'll wake up, what does she have left? And so for a while, the film just lets us live there, in that suspended time, before the plot tilts, before the secrets and the kidnappings, and in that stretch, I found myself completely on her side, despite barely knowing anything about who Ranga really was, because that's kind of the point. The movie starts by making us love her devotion first, and only then, slowly, it starts asking whether the person she's devoted to is the man she thinks he is. The trigger for the whole larger story comes in a seemingly small way, a hospital administrative check, one of those bureaucratic scenes you'd expect to be forgettable, but instead become the doorway to something much bigger, a financial audit, a new staff rotation, and suddenly someone in billing is looking closely at Ranga's documents, cross-checking his ID. And there's a discrepancy, a small glitch in the data that wouldn't matter in most lives but matters a lot when you're dealing with long-term care. The hospital wants to confirm his identity for insurance reasons. They ask for additional paperwork, and Amel, carrying around a lifetime of informal arrangements and half-complete documents like so many working-class people do, struggles to provide what they're looking for. It should be a minor inconvenience, but the movie turns it into a thread that, once pulled, begins to unravel the entire tapestry of her life. Because one day, as she's leaving yet another frustrating meeting with hospital administration, there's a new figure in the hallway, an older man in a well-tailored but understated batik shirt, flanked by a younger woman with fierce, tense eyes, and as they pass by the room where Ranga lies, something in their faces changes. There's a flicker of recognition, a ghost passing through their gaze, and they stop, almost involuntarily. The older man whispers a name, Ardi, and the younger woman, who we later learn is named Dina, his daughter, stiffens as if she's just seen someone she buried years ago. But of course, to Amel, this is all unbearably confusing, and the film plays it that way. We feel her confusion as the doctor introduces them. This is Pak Haleem, a longtime benefactor of the hospital, and his daughter. They are here for some charity work, and then, moments later, we watch as they peer through the glass at Ranga, their eyes wide, their bodies frozen, and this is where the story starts to fold in on itself. The Haleem family, who will soon become central to Amel's fate, are wealthy, influential, but not cartoonishly so. The film's great decision is that it never turns them into outright villains or saints. They are just people with power, grief, and a long history of secrets. Pak Haleem, it turns out, once had a son who went missing years ago, a son whose disappearance tore their family apart, left an unspoken wound in their home. And when he sees Ranga's face, lined with hospital shadows, he's convinced it's him, his long-lost Ardi, older, broken, but undeniably similar, and you can practically feel the ground shift beneath Amel's feet when she's pulled into a closed-door meeting with them, the hospital director, a lawyer, and suddenly what was a purely medical struggle becomes a legal, moral, and emotional battlefield. The Haleems want tests, they want answers, they want to know who this man really is, and if he truly is their son, then why is he here, living under a different name? With a wife and child who know nothing of their past, it's at this point where the film starts playing a dangerous but gripping game with identity, DNA tests, old photographs, inconsistent records, and we, the audience, are forced into a kind of limbo where we're not quite sure whether we want Ranga to be Ardi or not, because on one hand, if he is Ardi, then he belongs to this powerful family who could pay for his care, whose resources could give him the best chances of recovery, who could lift Amel out of her financial nightmare. But on the other hand, if he is Ardi, then Amel's entire marriage becomes a question mark. Her memories with him acquire a shadow of doubt, because who did she marry, really? And the film knows that this tension is brutal, so it gives us these quiet moments where she sits at his bedside, looking at his sleeping face, cross-referencing it with the Haleem's old photographs, staring at the similarities in the jawline, the shape of the eyebrows, wondering if she's been living beside a stranger, or if, in some twisted way, love makes whoever he is her husband regardless of what his birth certificate says. And I think that's where the film really dug its hooks into me, not just in the big reveals later, but in this liminal stretch where everyone is waiting for test results, for documentation, for confirmation, and during that wait, small interactions tell us a lot about who these characters really are. Amel is guarded but unfailingly polite with the Haleems. She doesn't want to alienate them because she senses their power, yet she also doesn't easily surrender her claim on her husband. There's a heartbreaking scene where Dina, the Haleem's daughter, watches Amel patiently feed Ranga pureed food through a tube, and you can see jealousy and admiration war in her eyes, because on some level, this woman might have lived the life Dina should have had with her brother. And then there's Pak Haleem himself, whose guilt over his son's disappearance is etched into every line of his face. He looks at Ranga with a desperate hope that borders on selfishness, because if he can make this man his son again, then maybe he can forgive himself, even if it means tearing apart the life of the woman sitting beside the bed, clutching a hand that might not legally belong to her at all. Once the DNA results finally arrive, the movie doesn't take the easy way out. It doesn't go for a dramatic courtroom reveal. Instead, the information trickles out in pieces, giving us room to feel each blow. We learn that yes, biologically, Ranga is indeed Ardi Haleem, the missing heir to the Haleem family. But that's only half the story, because the identity documents he's been using are not just mistaken, they're part of a deliberate act, a carefully constructed false identity that someone, somewhere, set up to erase Ardi's past and plant him into a new life. And this is where the word pemalsuan identitas, identity forgery, stops being a legal term and becomes a knife aimed at the heart of Amel's existence. Was her marriage just a cover? Did he know? Did he keep secrets from her? Or was he a victim too, as comatose in his inner life as he now is in his physical one? The film starts to weave in fragments of his backstory through police reports, scattered clues revealed in conversations, an old friend who shows up with a guilty conscience, and bit by bit, a picture forms. Years ago, Artie disappears after clashing with his family over their business ethics, debts, and expectations. Maybe he gets involved with the wrong crowd, maybe he's trying to build a life on his own terms, and somewhere along the line, he takes on the name Ranga, cutting ties with his past, or perhaps being forced to. We're never entirely sure, and that ambiguity is intentional. He's not there to defend himself, he's not there to give his version, so everyone else chooses the interpretation that best fits their need. To the Haleems, he's a lost son come home at last, whose past mistakes can be forgiven now that he's back under their roof. To Amel, he's still the man who held her hand during their child's birth, who laughed when they had nothing, who promised her a future. To the authorities, he's a legal headache, a fraud, a case file, and what the movie does so well is show how all these narratives collide over the unconscious body of a man who cannot confirm or deny any of it. As the Haleems move to legally assert their guardianship over Artie, Ranga, offering to pay for his care, move him to a private facility, and yes, open their doors to Amel and her daughter if they wish, the story could almost have settled into a rich family absorbs poor widow dynamic, but Tersesat Untuk Dipertemukan is much sharper than that. It refuses to let things become that comfortable. There's anxiety layered into every kind gesture, a sense that power, once extended, can just as easily be withdrawn, and Amel senses it, even if she can't always articulate it. You can feel her walking on eggshells in the Haleem mansion, this sprawling house with polished marble floors that reflect her hesitant steps, family portraits that don't include her, locked rooms that hold memories she wasn't there to share, and a domestic staff that watches her with a mix of pity and curiosity. She's grateful, of course she is. The bills are being paid, her husband is now surrounded by the best specialists, her child has access to a world of comfort she could never have imagined. But there's a scene where Naya, her daughter, picks up an expensive toy in the Haleem living room, and one of the aunts, let's call her Tant Myra, gently but firmly takes it away, saying, "Careful, dear, that's not really yours." And in that small moment, the film crystallizes Amel's internal fear. Nothing here is really hers, not the house, not the wealth, and maybe, if papers and bloodlines have their say, not even the man lying in that upstairs room. And this is where the question of survival starts to move from emotional to literal, because wrapped inside all this familial tension is a darker subplot that slowly claws its way to the surface, the matter of Naya's kidnapping, which sounds like a twist from a trashy drama on paper, but in the film, unfolds with a nightmare logic that feels all too plausible. It doesn't happen as a flashy, action-packed set piece, it begins with small lapses in security, arguments between Amel and the Haleems over what's best for the child, and the cold realization that when identity is disputed, custody is too. The Haleem family lawyers begin whispering about legal guardianship, lineage, inheritance. They start implying that Naya's future will be better if it's managed properly, which is their way of hinting that maybe Amel isn't the most stable, rational decision maker right now. And the film does something really uncomfortable here. It makes us watch as the narrative about Amel begins to shift. Around dinner tables and behind closed doors, she goes from the devoted wife to the woman he never told us about, from mother of our grandchild to a possible obstacle, and you see how language becomes a weapon long before anyone snatches a child from a playground, which is why, when the kidnapping finally happens, it doesn't feel like a sudden shock from another genre. It feels like the inevitable result of a family war, conflict sliding out of the realm of words and into violent action. Naya disappears one rainy afternoon when Amel, exhausted from yet another meeting with the family lawyer, lets her guard down for a moment. The movie doesn't show it in graphic detail, we just see the lead up, Naya playing in the mansion garden, a new nanny introduced just days before, security cameras that conveniently malfunction, and then, in a dizzying flurry of intercut shots, she's been taken. Car speeding away, Amel screams echoing through the courtyard, the Haleems rushing outside, shouting orders into their phones, and that's when the shaky, intimate tone of the film shifts into something jagged and raw, because whatever resentment anyone had before, now there's a missing child, and for the first time, everyone's interests truly collide instead of just brushing against each other. Here's where the identity forgery suddenly becomes more than a past sin, it becomes the motive, the fuel for something monstrous, because whoever organized this kidnapping isn't just after a ransom, they are after leverage, and they know that this little girl is at the crossroads of several powerful currents. If her father is legally Adi Haleem, she might have a claim on the Haleem fortune, and if his identity has been forged, there may be people out there who desperately don't want the truth to come fully out, people who benefited from his disappearance, from the assumption that he was gone forever, and now that his body has resurfaced, quietly breathing on a hospital bed, these forces are moving. The film paints this faceless threat through glimpses. A shady acquaintance from Ranga's past who recognizes his photo in the news, a tense phone call overheard by a housekeeper, a piece of paper with numbers and initials that doesn't make sense until later, and through it all, Mel is shoved into the center of a storm she never asked for, her daughter missing, her husband unreachable, and the very people who could help her are the same ones whose motives she's learned she can't fully trust. Performance-wise, this is where the actress playing Amel absolutely owns the film, because the script puts her through the emotional ringer, and without her grounding, all of this could have collapsed into melodrama for melodrama's sake. There are scenes where she's near hysterical with grief, searching every corner of the mansion, yelling at baffled maids and stoic security guards, but the movie always brings her back down to this quiet, trembling determination, like when she sits alone in Naya's now empty bedroom, touching her toys, her clothes, and whispering apologies into the silence, blaming herself for letting money and comfort lull her into a sense of safety. And then, there are confrontations with the Haleems that feel like small-scale tragedies all on their own. Take the moment when she accuses them outright. If you hadn't dragged us here, if you hadn't messed with our lives, she'd still be with me, her voice breaking, and you can see the hurt in Pak Haleem's eyes, not because he's innocent, but because on some level, he knows she's right, that his desire to reclaim his son has rippled outward into disaster. Thematically, this is where the title, Tersesat Untuk Dipertemukan, starts singing in full force, because everyone here is lost, not just geographically, not just emotionally, but morally, ethically. Mel is lost in a mansion that isn't home. The Haleems are lost in their regret and their fear. Ranga Adi is lost between two identities, one he was born with and one he built or was given. And Naya, the child at the center of all this, is physically lost somewhere in the city, held by people who see her as a bargaining chip. Yet the film insists, in these quiet, lingering shots, that sometimes being lost is the only way to reveal who is truly willing to look for you, who is willing to walk into the dark. And this is why the film resonates so deeply with so many viewers, especially in Indonesia, where stories about sacrifice, family duty, and maternal strength have always had a strong emotional pull, but it also feels modern. Not in a flashy, high-tech way, but in its understanding of how institutions, hospitals, legal systems, wealthy families, can so quickly reduce a person to a case, a burden, a line on a ledger. The pacing of the middle act is meticulous, and some people might call it slow. But I think that slowness is intentional. The director wants you to feel the weight of days without answers, the ache of waiting for a phone to ring, for a text to come in, for a detective to walk through the door with good news. And he uses the quiet to build tension rather than release it. There's this powerful sequence where time is conveyed through small changes in the house, a missing child poster taped onto the gate, a half-eaten plate of food on Amel's bedside table, the sound of Dina breaking down in the bathroom when she thinks no one is listening, and over it all, a radio newscast about rising crime in the city, like the world outside is carrying on with its own chaos. Indifferent to the particular storm in this one family, cinematographically, the film loves contrasts, cramped urban spaces versus the wide emptiness of the Haleem estate, the sterile brightness of hospital rooms versus the warm but suffocating glow of the family's dining room, and particularly, the use of reflections, mirrors, windows, polished floors, constantly splitting characters in two, visually echoing the central motif of fractured identity, and we get some beautifully framed shots of Amel and Dina sharing the screen, often with some reflective surface between them, making them look like two versions of the same woman on different sides of a life that could have gone differently. Speaking of Dina, her character arc is one of the most fascinating in the film, because she starts off with this ice-cold hostility towards Amel, and honestly, you can't entirely blame her. From her perspective, this stranger appears out of nowhere, claiming to be her brother's wife, presenting a niece she never knew existed, and taking up space in a home that's still haunted by his absence. Dina's pain comes out as sarcasm, suspicion, controlling behavior, but as the story unfolds, especially after Naya's kidnapping, you see the wall around her heart crack. She begins to see Amel not as a threat, but as another victim of the same currents that swept away her brother. There's a late-night scene in the kitchen where the two women finally have something like a real conversation, sitting on stools with mugs of cold coffee, and Dina admits that when her brother first disappeared, she used to dream that he had created a new family somewhere, that he was safe, loved, that someone out there was taking care of him in ways she and her father couldn't, and when she first saw Amel in the hospital, she felt this irrational anger, because suddenly that fantasy was real, but it hadn't brought him home, it had just taken him further away, and that kind of emotional complexity is what keeps the film from collapsing into simple good versus evil dynamics. Now, I want to talk a bit about how the movie handles the legal and procedural aspects, because this could so easily have become a dull slog of police briefings and court scenes, but instead, the director wisely keeps the focus on the emotional stakes, giving us just enough detail to understand the noose tightening around Amel without drowning us in exposition. We learn that the identity forgery is not just a bureaucratic hiccup, it's tied to a criminal network that specializes in giving new identities to people who want to disappear, some innocent, some not, and Ranga, or Adi, whichever name you want to use, ended up in their hands at some point in his past. We see flashes of this through a series of jagged, impressionistic flashbacks that might be memories or might be imagined reconstructions, a younger Adi arguing with someone in a dim back room, signing papers he doesn't fully understand, handing over his old IDs, getting a new one in exchange, and looking into a mirror with a strange, unsettled expression, like someone who has just stepped into a parallel life and isn't sure if he can ever step back. Those same people, or their successors, are now involved in the kidnapping, because information about his resurfacing circulated quietly through unofficial channels, and to them, Naya is a way to ensure that certain truths stay buried, or that certain debts get paid. The movie doesn't fully untangle every strand of this web, and honestly, that's one of my only criticisms. Some viewers might find the criminal backstory undercooked, more of a shadowy backdrop than a fully realized thread, but at the same time, that haziness preserves something important, the sense that the real story here isn't about masterminds and conspiracies, it's about how ordinary lives get caught in the fallout of decisions made in desperation. What absolutely is fully realized, though, is Amel's transformation from a passive caregiver into an active fighter, and that journey is maybe the most satisfying aspect of the film. At the beginning, she's defined by endurance, by what she can suffer quietly without complaint, but by the final act, grief has carved a new kind of courage into her, and there's a standout sequence where she defies both the Haleems and the police to chase down a lead on her own. She receives an anonymous text with a blurry photo of Naya, her daughter's eyes wide and lost, and a location pinned somewhere on the edge of the city. She's told to come alone, no police, and of course everyone tells her not to go. It's too dangerous, it's probably a trap, but when you've already lost almost everything, what's one more risk? So she goes, and the film follows her through the outskirts of the city, through narrow alleys and half-abandoned warehouses, the camera tight on her face, her breathing loud in the sound mix, intercut with shots of a half-lit room where Naya sits chained to a bed frame, humming to herself to stay calm. And even though this whole rescue attempt ends in a kind of tragic stalemate, the kidnappers slip away, Naya is almost reached and then yanked back at the last second, and the police eventually arrive too late. The point is not that Amel suddenly becomes an action hero, but that she chooses, finally, to stop waiting for other people to save her child, and that choice, that first step into danger, becomes the turning point that forces the Haleems to truly recognize her as more than a temporary inconvenience in their lives. There's a shot, right after this failed rescue, of Amel collapsing on the ground outside the warehouse, empty-handed, screaming her daughter's name into the night, and behind her, we see Dina and Pak Haleem, who arrived too late as well, standing there, utterly helpless, having to face the reality that their money, their influence, their carefully organized strategies couldn't prevent this woman from walking alone into hell while they were still debating the best course of action. It's in this aftermath that you really feel a shift in the family dynamics. The Haleems stop talking about what's best for the child in that abstract, paternalistic way, and start listening to the person who has actually been raising her, and for the first time, it feels like they're coming together not out of obligation or guilt, but out of a shared, gut-deep fear of what might happen if they don't. The film's final act walks this delicate line between hope and devastation, because it knows it owes the audience some kind of resolution, but it also knows that life, especially for someone like Amel, doesn't suddenly become neat just because secrets have been revealed. The identity forgery is eventually traced back to a specific ring of criminals, arrests are made, and through a dangerous negotiation. I won't spoil every beat of that process, because part of the power of the last half hour is in watching it all unfold, step by excruciating step. Naya is finally recovered. There's a scene of reunion that could have been syrupy, but instead is almost shockingly subdued. Amel sees her daughter sitting on a bench at the police station, a bit bruised, dazed, but alive, and for a moment, she just stands there, frozen, because after so many days of imagining the worst, her brain can't compute that this is real, and when she finally moves, there's no run in slow motion, no swelling music. She just drops to her knees in front of Naya, touches her face with shaking hands, and they both cry quietly, as if afraid that louder sobs might break the fragile reality they've just stepped into. Meanwhile, Ranga Adi remains in his coma almost to the very end, which is a bold narrative choice, because a more conventional story would have him waking up just in time to testify, to apologize, to reunite, but this film resists that easy payoff, and in doing so, keeps our focus on Amel, on the choices she has to make without his input, without his guidance. A late scene really drives this home. Amel sits beside his bed one more time, now knowing his full identity, knowing that the man she loved was, in some ways, always someone else as well, and she talks to him honestly for the first time. She admits her anger, her betrayal, her confusion, tells him that even if he wakes up, things can't just go back to the way they were, that there will be questions to answer, forgiveness to earn, and in a small but crucial moment, she also tells him that she's no longer doing this just for him, or for some promised future. They've already lost too much time. She's doing it for herself, for Naya, for the life she intends to build with or without him awake, that might be, emotionally. The quiet climax of the movie, a woman reclaiming her agency in the one room where she used to be nothing but a caretaker, waiting for the slightest twitch of a hand, now becoming the one who defines what happens next. And yet, the film does give us one last ambiguous beat with Ranga, in the final montage, as things slowly, tentatively, start to settle, Naya beginning to smile again. The Haleem house adjusting to new boundaries where Amel is no longer a guest but not quite fully family. Investigations winding down, lawyers drafting papers that reflect a new, painfully earned truth. We get a close-up of Ranga's face, the light changing on his eyelids, and we see the faintest flicker of movement in his fingers, maybe a reflex, maybe the first sign of emerging consciousness, and then the screen cuts away, refusing to confirm whether he wakes up or stays trapped in that liminal state, because ultimately, the film isn't about whether he comes back to them, it's about who they've become in his absence. And I really respect that choice, because it mirrors the uncertain nature of real-life healing, where closure is rarely as neat as we want it to be. Now, in terms of performances, the actress playing Amel is the ship this whole movie sails on, and she nails it. Her work is all about micro-expressions, the way her jaw tightens when someone questions her rights as a mother, the way her eyes briefly light up with hope when the doctors mention a slight improvement in Ranga's condition, only for that hope to be tamped down by a lifetime of disappointments. She never plays Amel as a saint. She's stubborn, sometimes irrational, sometimes so consumed by her own pain that she lashes out at the wrong people. But that flawed humanity is exactly what makes her so compelling. Dina, as the complicated almost sister-in-law, gives one of those performances that grows on you the more you think about it. She has fewer big tearful scenes than Amel, but her quiet resentment, her slow reorienting towards solidarity, is written all over her body language, and Pak Haleem, with his mix of guilt and entitlement, is perfectly cast. You can see the man who sincerely wants to make things right and the man who has spent a lifetime getting what he wants through money and influence living inside the same body, occasionally in open conflict with each other, and the supporting cast, the lawyers, the hospital staff, even the kidnappers who get little screen time, are just grounded enough that the world feels lived in rather than stagey. The music deserves a mention too. It's not a bombastic score, more a series of subtle motifs that creep in at key emotional beats, a piano theme that appears whenever Amel is alone, a low, throbbing sound design element whenever the past threatens to overwhelm the present, and in some scenes, total silence, which the movie wisely recognizes can sometimes be more powerful than any swelling orchestra, especially in those hospital sequences, where the only sounds are the beeps and hums of machines. In terms of pacing and structure, as I mentioned, the film is unafraid to linger, and some viewers are going to feel that, especially in the first half hour. But the payoff of that investment is that by the time Naya is kidnapped and the identity forgery comes fully to light, you're not just watching plot twists, you're watching events happen to people you've come to know intimately, people whose losses you feel, and that transforms what could have been a simple thriller into something more like a character study wrapped in a mystery. Audience reaction, from what we've seen in the early buzz and social media chatter, has been intense. There are, of course, those who criticize the film for being too heavy, for front-loading so much sadness and only offering hints of redemption. But there's also a huge contingent of viewers who have embraced it precisely because it's unapologetically emotional. They see in Amel the reflection of countless real women they know, women who hold families together quietly, who navigate hospitals and bureaucracy and the shifting sands of in-law expectations, often with very little support, and for them, Tersesat Untuk Dipertemukan doesn't feel like an escapist fantasy. It feels like a heightened mirror, reflecting truths they live in quieter ways every day. There have also been interesting conversations about class and power in the film, with some fans pointing out how rare it is to see a story where the wealthy family is neither completely villainized nor let off the hook, but instead shown as deeply flawed, complicit in harm, and yet also capable of growth. And the online discourse around the identity forgery subplot has sparked discussions about how easy it can be, in some countries, for people to slip through the cracks of the official system, to live under names that don't quite match their documents, to have half-legible lives that only become fully visible when something goes terribly wrong. Culturally, too, the film hits a nerve in how it depicts motherhood not just as unconditional love, but as constant negotiation, with institutions, with families, with the past. There's a line, late in the film, where someone tells Amel, "You're strong," and she snaps back, "I'm tired." And that might be one of the realest moments in the whole story, because the narrative has spent 2 hours showing us that strength and exhaustion often come as a pair, that resilience is not some heroic, endless reservoir but something that gets worn down, replenished, worn down again, in cycles, and for many viewers, that line hit harder than any of the bigger twist reveals. So, if we step back and look at Tersesat Untuk Dipertemukan as a whole, what we're left with is this layered, often painful, but ultimately deeply human film about what it means to belong, to a person, to a family, to a name, and what happens when all of that gets called into question. It asks whether blood is thicker than love, whether a marriage can survive the revelation that it was built on half-truths, whether a child's identity is determined more by the people who raise her or the papers that define her lineage, and it refuses to give easy, one-size-fits-all answers. Instead, it leaves us with images: Amel walking out of the hospital into the morning light after one of her many night vigils, her shoulders still slumped but her gaze a little clearer; Dina sitting beside Naya, teaching her how to draw, trying to make up for lost time with a niece she almost never knew; Haleem standing alone in front of a family photo that no longer matches the reality of who's sitting at his dinner table, and somewhere, in that quiet, almost invisible finger twitch on Ranga's bed, the suggestion that there are still chapters to be written in this story, still conversations to be had, apologies to be made, explanations to be offered, but the film wisely leaves that unwritten, handing it over to us, the audience, to imagine the best or the worst, depending on how hopeful we're feeling. So if you're the kind of viewer who craves neat resolutions and happy endings with all the loose threads tied up, this movie might frustrate you. But if you're willing to sit in ambiguity, to follow a character like Amel through the maze of grief, betrayal, and reluctant hope, Tersesat Untuk Dipertemukan offers one of the most emotionally rich journeys of its year. It's a challenging watch, not because of graphic content or complicated plot mechanics, but because it keeps pushing you to empathize, to see every side, to question who deserves what in a situation where nobody is completely innocent and nobody is completely damned. And by the time the credits roll, you might not have all the answers, but you'll have a heart full of bruised, complicated feelings, and maybe that's the real mark of a powerful drama. So if you haven't seen it yet and you've somehow listened this far into a spoiler-filled breakdown, consider this your invitation not just to watch the film, but to really sit with it, to notice the details in the performances, the small shifts in how characters address each other, the way the camera frames doors and thresholds, signaling who's on the inside and who's still standing at the edge, waiting to be invited in. And if you have seen it, let me know which moments hit you hardest. Was it Amel's quiet confession of anger to her unconscious husband, Naya's fearful hums in the dark, Dina's breaking point in that bathroom, or maybe just that single, devastating line, "I'm not strong, I'm tired"? For me, it's the cumulative effect of all of them, the way they build into a story that feels less like a puzzle to be solved and more like a wound to be understood. And that is why Tersesat Untuk Dipertemukan lingers long after the lights come up, asking not just what happened to these characters, but what we might do, who we might become, if we ever found ourselves just as lost, waiting, hoping, and fighting to be brought together again. And as we bring this long, emotional journey of a review to a close, I want to leave you with one more question, held gently in the same uncertain hope the movie leaves its characters with. There are films that open like a whisper and carry you by the wrist into rooms you didn't know you could walk through, and then there is Tersesat Untuk Dipertemukan, a 2025 Indonesian drama thriller that sneaks its way into your chest one detail at a time, without fireworks, without a rush, just the minute-by-minute texture of a woman holding her life together like a thread, and as the hours pass, you realize the thread is tied to a knot that could undo a family, a city, maybe even the idea of who we say we are. This is the kind of story that catches you off guard because it refuses to play the game of big gestures. It lives in the small ones, the half-smiles and the long hospital corridors, in the bend of a mother's spine at 2 in the morning as she watches a machine breathe for the man she loves, and in the shiver that runs through a quiet kitchen when the doorbell rings and fate finally steps in wearing someone else's name. And if that sounds heavy, it is, but it's also human in a way that feels disarmingly intimate, like overhearing a confession you're not supposed to hear, like being trusted with something brutal and ordinary at the same time. So before I break down how this film works its slow burn spell and why its title, Tersesat Untuk Dipertemukan, which roughly evokes the idea of getting lost so you can at last be found, becomes a map of the whole emotional terrain, let me get the housekeeping out of the way. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel, Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, let's set the scene because context matters for a movie like this. We're in 2025, a year where Indonesian cinema seems more comfortable than ever weaving domestic melodrama with thriller bones, where the stakes are not a global conspiracy, not a giant heist, but a set of papers, a hospital bill, a child sleeping in a next room, and a name that won't stand still. And from the very first minute, the film tells you what game it's playing, not with a twist, but with a rhythm, the soft ventilator hiss and the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor, the distant city rumble, the palpable sense of time slowly killing and saving everything. It's Amel's world, a world defined by caregiving, by routine made sacred and draining, by a love that has to be measured in teaspoons because she's pouring it every day into someone who cannot respond, her husband, suspended in a coma after an accident that the movie sketches just enough for us to feel its violence without lingering on it, and so we meet this marriage in a state of pause, a love put on hold, and we watch Amel, not as a saint, but as a person whose quiet strength keeps taking shape in the way she lifts a plastic curtain, dabs his lips with water, negotiates politely with a nurse who has seen it all, and sells a pair of earrings because the bill has to get paid. The film feels intensely present in these details, patient, textured, making you feel how heavy one day can be. And it's in that space, a space of small mercies and financial dread, that destiny chooses to get messy, and the mess has a surname, Haleem, the family you've heard about even if you don't know them, the kind of family whose house looks like a statement and whose last name opens doors, except what opens this door is a mistake or an omen or a coincidence, depending on whether you believe in the story the film is telling, because one night, after another bureaucratic loop at the hospital, a file is flagged, an ID number pings, and a polite man in an expensive shirt says he's sorry to bother but could they please talk about her husband. He has questions, a picture that looks too familiar, a curiosity that is almost tenderness. This is how they enter, not as villains but as gravity, and the Haleem family doesn't sweep in like a storm, they arrive like a promise, maybe help with the bills, maybe answers to why her husband had certain unusual entries in his records, maybe closure, maybe trouble. Here's the beauty of the storytelling, it lets Amel be both grateful and afraid, and it lets us be both with her, because while the Haleem matriarch carries a sadness at the edges of her smile, and the Haleem patriarch speaks in careful, lawyerly sentences, there's a warmth there, a sincerity that might be real, and then again, it might also be strategy, because wealth has a way of blurring the line between generosity and control, and the film is so adept at showing how those two can look almost identical in the moment. So we have the setup, and the title starts to make more sense, because to be found by the Haleems, a family whose influence is a weather system, requires first getting lost in their world, and Amel, who has kept herself small so she can survive the attention of doctors and the indifference of storage rooms full of paperwork, suddenly finds herself seen, and not just by them but by a larger machinery of recognition. And that's when identity becomes the ticking clock of the story. I want to be careful with spoilers, because this is the kind of film that's not built on one twist but on the feeling of discovery, as if each scene peels a layer you didn't know was there. so I'll keep to what the trailer suggests and what the synopsis allows. At a crucial point, the identity of Amel's husband is called into question, and the question's cut wide, as in, is the man she married who she thinks he is, or has she, without knowing, built her life next to a stranger with a borrowed face, or worse, a stolen name? This is not a gimmick, it's not a cheap gotcha, it's an accusation that leaks into every memory, every tiny act of intimacy, and the film has the patience to show what that does to a woman's sense of self. Imagine waking up to a morning when your husband's name suddenly feels like glass in your mouth, and every time you say it, you might be participating in a lie, and now imagine that the only person who might clarify anything is lying there in front of you, breathing but silent, and everyone around you has a story they want you to accept, all of them filtered through their needs. The hospital wants payment, the Haleem family wants certainty, the police want to close a loop in a case that's been nagging them, and neighbors want gossip. The section of the film that deals with this unraveling is extraordinary not because it gives us courtroom-level revelations but because it makes us live inside the waiting, and that waiting is brutal. We watch Amel follow breadcrumbs, an old phone number, a flash drive with harmless photos that feel sinister just because they exist, a piece of paper with a name that isn't her husband's and yet is attached to his blood type, and we watch her navigate the Haleem house, which is its own character, a place where silence speaks in marble and unblinking family portraits, where a security guard with two kind eyes stands a little too close, where a dining table becomes a chessboard for politeness, and we, the audience, become complicit, because we're trying to read those looks too, trying to decide whether the Haleem daughter's friendliness is a bridge or a trap. It's in this thickening cloud of uncertainty that the film allows a shift. The question of identity becomes the question of safety, and the person who is most vulnerable is not the man in the coma but the child in the other room, Amel's little one, whose presence has been a light in this otherwise dark hall and who, dare I say, is the purest heartbeat in the movie. If you've ever watched a thriller that uses a child to raise the stakes, you know the risk. Sometimes it's manipulative, but here it feels earned because we've sat with this family. We know what that kid means to Amel's ability to survive the day, and so when the plotting hardens and the heat of the narrative climbs, the threat that comes is not a car chase or a gun, it's a vanishing, kidnapping, and the word itself tastes wrong in the mouth because this is not a movie that treats the child as an object, it's a movie that has taught us to see him as a living argument for what gives a person the power to keep going, and so when he's taken, yes, the film goes there. It doesn't linger on cruelty but it doesn't spare us the terror. The story snaps from searching to sprinting, and somehow, without losing the delicacy of a family drama, it finds the propulsion of a thriller. Now, if you're worried we're in for a run-of-the-mill police procedural, breathe, because the film refuses that lane. It sticks to Amel, to her resourcefulness, to the quiet network of people who have always been invisible in films like this: nurses, hospital clerks, market aunties, janitors who know which CCTV cameras actually work. And those people become an ad hoc community who move not because they've been paid but because they recognize themselves in her. And what is identity if not who recognizes you, who tells you they see you when the system refuses to? It's in these sequences that the filmmaking shines in ways you don't have to be a tech geek to appreciate. The camera moves like a witness, gliding when it needs to stay respectful, snapping to a handheld jitter when we're in Amel's head, turning the buzz of fluorescent lights into a kind of pressure cooker. And the color palette, if I can use that phrase without sounding precious, is all late afternoon, all browns and softened blues, the color of exhaustion and grace. There's a set piece involving a rainstorm that, in any other movie, would be all about spectacle, but here it's about how sound swallowing the world can make you feel alone even in a crowd, and that loneliness becomes almost tactile. You can feel it stick to your skin. I wish I could tell you the film avoids melodrama altogether, but that would be untrue. And why should it, when the story's natural register is the ache of families trying to define themselves? Instead, what it does, and what I admire, is it earns its swells. It earns the tearful confrontations and the shouted names, by giving us quiet for so long that when the volume rises, our bodies accept it as organic, inevitable performances. Let's talk, because without the actors this entire machine collapses. The woman who plays Amel is, in a word, precise, which is to say she never forces a moment. She lets fear grow in the corners of her eyes, she lets a smile die on her lips without theatrics, and in the handful of scenes where she must explode, she keeps it human, a broken dam of sound that still feels private. And the man in the bed, what can you do with a role like that? Strangely enough, he gives a performance, through stillness, through the way his presence forces people to reveal themselves, and that's not easy to sustain. The Haleem matriarch, too, is outstanding. She carries grief like jewelry, not flaunted but always there, and in one scene where she confesses a story from years ago about a choice that still keeps her awake, the entire air of the movie changes. You feel the weight slide into the frame, and suddenly you understand how a well-meaning family can still be an engine of harm, because love does not absolve you from the consequences of wanting control. Pacing-wise, the film is a novel in 3 acts. The first a litany of daily rituals that builds empathy and dread, the second an unraveling that raises questions faster than it answers them, and the third a pivot into a rescue that still refuses to be a simple mission, because what is a rescue when the person you're trying to save might be at the center of a story built on lies? And here's where I want to talk about the title again. Because it's not just poetic, it's a thesis. Tersesat Untuk Dipertemukan, the idea that sometimes the only way to arrive anywhere true is to wander, to get lost in someone else's story, to press against the edges of your own fear until you're forced to meet the stranger in the mirror, and the film uses that to interrogate identity in specifically Indonesian ways that I won't pretend to master. But even as an outsider to those specifics, you can feel the friction of names and papers and stories that outrun the documents meant to hold them. There's a thread about a national ID that refuses to match a fingerprint, about a hospital clerk who can't process a file without an original card, about a neighborhood that knows someone by a nickname and a family who knows him by a childhood photo, and the man himself, silent, unreachable, existing as these multiple, competing truths at once. And it makes for a drama that feels both local and universal, steeped in the bureaucratic faith that a laminated card can stand in for a life. The scripting is careful not to demonize the system outright, though I appreciated that, because there are people in it who are kind, who bend the rules where they can, who let the stamps of bureaucracy hit the drawer instead of the page, and that subtle generosity keeps the film from being smug. What about style, you ask? What about the craft? Because a story like this can choke if the direction is too heavy or too showy, and no, the filmmaker here finds a median. Expressive without being fussy. A style that lets an empty corridor feel like a question mark, that treats a face like a landscape without stuffing it full of symbolism. The score is spare, piano keys that sound like a heartbeat, strings that wander rather than command, occasional silence that roars louder than anything, and the sound design deserves a mention because the film understands that in hospitals and big houses and city streets, the sound of machines and rain and traffic can reflect your inner weather. As a viewer, you might find the first half hour demanding if you're impatient for plot, tiny actions, tiny choices, and a lot of waiting, but that patience is what makes the second and third acts bite. And anyway, for some of us, the real thrill is watching how a person chooses, over and over, to be faithful when it isn't easy. Characters beyond the immediate circle are sketched with economy and affection, too. There's a nurse whose resigned humor becomes a balm, a neighbor who gossips in a way that isn't cruelty so much as a survival hobby, a police officer who surprises you by being decent and limited at once, and an identity fixer, a small-time operator in a too-tight shirt who can't stop saying he's helping people when you know he's also hurting them, and each one comes into Amel's orbit like a satellite with its own gravity, small pulls that add up to a force field around her. The Haleem son, a man torn between obeying the family and obeying his sense of right, has one of those arcs that could have gone melodramatic, but the actor plays it with restraint. He watches a lot before he speaks, and when he finally chooses, the movie lets it land without a sermon. Performance aside, the writing gives these people enough contradictions to feel alive. The matriarch who gives and takes with the same hand, the patriarch who uses reason as a shield, the security guard who understands power and chooses kindness anyway. And Amel's marriage, imagine that. How do you review a relationship where one partner lies still, and yet the film makes it clear that marriages speak even when one person cannot, through memory, through gesture, through the fierce defense of a name. There's a flashback structure in play that, to the movie's credit, never becomes a puzzle box. It's just glimpses, a walk to a night market, a fight about money that ends in laughter, a moment when you realize how two people can make a universe out of nothing. And those little lights are what make the later darkness bearable. Thematically, besides identity, besides motherhood and survival, the film is interested in the idea of mercy, who gets it, who claims the power to bestow it, and whether mercy can also be a kind of violence when it comes wrapped as charity that asks you to give up your voice. And it's interested in forgetting, in how a society can ask you to forget to make room for stability, even when forgetting is another word for erasing the truth, and that philosophical Undertow makes the thriller component feel bigger than a missing child. As urgent as that is, it's this all-at-once quality, domestic drama, social commentary, suspense engine, that gives the movie its texture, its sense that life does not come in genres, and yet the filmmakers still know how to shape an arc, so you don't get lost in the fog, you are guided, tenderly, sternly, toward a reckoning. Now, spoiler-safe talk about the third act. The kidnapping forces alliances you might not expect, not because the film wants to surprise you but because necessity rearranges people, and the Haleems, who have been both help and threat, become, in a way, both more themselves and more human than you've allowed, and Amel, who has been surviving on endurance, finds a core of ferocity that frightens even her, and there's a scene, this is not really a spoiler, where she negotiates with someone who has her child, and the camera holds so long on her face I thought I might scream, not because it's manipulative, but because there is nothing left to dress the moment. It's a woman and her voice and the animal inside that voice, and you will know exactly what I mean when you see it. The resolution, and I won't give it away, refuses to tidy the moral math, and I respect that so much. It gives you closure where you need it, and it leaves open the questions that don't end just because a movie does. It also repositions the man in the bed in a way that is almost elegant, a gesture that acknowledges both the harm and the love that have existed in the same space, and if that sounds like a cop-out, it isn't. It's a refusal to reduce a human life to a plot device. Will everyone love the final stretch? Probably not. There's a 10-minute passage where the film lingers on aftermaths, on silent rooms, on hands touching in forgiveness or farewell, and depending on your appetite for quiet, you might check your watch, but if you stay inside the rhythm the film has taught you, it pays off in a way that feels like being allowed to breathe after being held underwater for a long time. In terms of audience reaction, from what I've seen and felt, this is a conversation starter, the kind of film that has people telling their own family stories, about paperwork gone wrong, about names that change depending on whose lips say them, about the cruelty of systems that forget the poor, and about the small armies of kindness that keep people going in spite of those systems. I've heard from viewers who cried their way through the middle and then felt strangely calm at the end, not because everything is okay but because the film makes room for the idea that you can stand again, even if you have to relearn your name while you do it. Culturally, I think this movie lands inside a broader discourse in Indonesia and beyond about identity and belonging, about the intersection of wealth and mercy, about how families who can silence the room sometimes forget that there are rooms they cannot enter, and the Haleem family, in that sense, is an archetype with nuance. Not cartoon villains but people who believe in their narrative power and are shocked when someone like Amel refuses to accept it. I appreciate how the movie refuses to dunk on them entirely, how it gives even the powerful the dignity of complexity, because that's the only way a moral conversation stays interesting after the credits. From a craft standpoint, I could say, sure, maybe one or two transitional scenes repeat a bit we've already felt, Amel checking coins, adjusting blankets, the Haleem gate closing with a heavy thunk, but those repetitions feel almost intentional, like the filmmakers want you to sense the grind that makes drastic choices feel inevitable. The cinematography makes a virtue of tight spaces, too, using door frames and window reflections to turn rooms into boxes of thought, and when the film opens up, rooftops, rain-soaked streets, it doesn't lose its intimacy, it just lets you hear the city as another character, not hostile, not kind, just there, a fact like weather, technically small, but I loved how the film uses the texture of paper, the crinkle of a photocopy, the stiffness of an official letter, to underscore its obsession with identity, as if the movie is whispering that our lives often get flattened into documents that cannot hold our contradictions. On the question of language and performance, there's a lot to savor if you lean into how people actually talk when they're tired and scared. The script avoids speechifying, most of the time, and lets subtext do the work. There is one monologue, if you can call it that, where Amel unloads in a way that risks sanctifying her, but again, the actor keeps it grounded by letting her voice falter in all the wrong places, letting anger be messy and unphotogenic. The kidnappers, let's talk about them without specifics, are not painted with horror movie strokes. We're spared a grotesque, and instead we get ordinary desperation, which is more frightening because it's more plausible. This is a film that wants us to sit with systems, not monsters, and that choice makes the moral vision bigger. I can imagine some viewers wanting more context about the husband's alleged double life, if we can call it that, and while the film gives us enough to keep the story honest, it resists the temptation to turn him into a mystery box we need to solve. And again, I think that's correct, because the story isn't about him, much as it circles his name. It's about what happens to the people orbiting him when his name starts sliding around like oil on water. In terms of influence and company, Tersesat Untuk Dipertemukan feels like it belongs to a generation of films that understand domesticity as a site of epic conflict, where the kitchen sink is an altar and a battlefield. And in 2025, that feels of the moment, not because the world is more broken now than before, but because we're finally telling the truth about where the wars are actually being fought. As for reception, I have this sense, a gut level one, that the film will gather quiet champions rather than blow up as a phenomenon, the kind of movie people recommend in private messages, with a warning to have tissues, with a note that it's slower than the trailer suggests and braver than they expected, and those are the films that last. Now, let's address something that might be lingering for you. Does the film justify its length, its insistence on making us look at waiting, at paperwork, at the look on a woman's face when she's been up for 20 hours? My answer is yes, because the movie is about endurance, not just Amel's, but everyone's, and to communicate endurance, you have to make the audience endure with you, and as much as that sounds like a dare, it's also an invitation to empathy that you can't fake. Yes, you could imagine a cut that's 10 minutes shorter and tighter in the middle, but you'd lose the drift that makes the later riptide feel earned. In the end, what sticks is the clarity of the central performance, the moral courage of the writing, and a handful of images that won't stop visiting you. A child's backpack on a chair, a glass of water next to a sleeping man whose mind is off somewhere you cannot follow, a gate that opens because a small security camera finally caught the right face, a mother in a stairwell quietly counting down from 10 before she calls out to gather herself. If you've ever loved someone so much you were willing to lie for them, this film will feel like a mirror you might not want to look into but can't avoid. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of someone else's mercy and realized that mercy came with strings, the film will give you a language for that unease. What about the Haleem family's power? You might ask, does the film indict them? Not exactly. It indicts the idea that power can tell its own story and make it stick, and then it shows what happens when a woman who has no power except the truth of her love refuses to recite that story, and that refusal, quiet, persistent, and backed by a dozen small helpers, is what topples the unsaid hierarchy in the final act. There's one last thing I want to acknowledge, because it matters to the emotional tone. The film doesn't treat pain as spectacle. We don't need graphic images to care. We need human scale, and the film keeps everything human scale, even at its tensest. So what you get, overall, is a carefully wrought experience, a movie that believes in the dignity of ordinary people and the danger of identity when it becomes a currency, a story that asks, at every turn, who are we when our name is taken? Who are we when our child is gone? Who are we when our love meets a past we did not consent to? And it holds those questions not like a trial but like a vigil. As a final verdict, if that's even the right word for something that wants contemplation more than applause, I'll say this: Tersesat Untuk Dipertemukan is worth your time and your patience, not because it's perfect, it isn't, but because it is honest and tender and brave where it counts, because it stitches thriller momentum to the fabric of daily life without tearing either, because it leaves you a little softer and a little sharper at the same time, capable of seeing the people in your own life who carry their love like a quiet labor, who make choices invisible to the world that ripple for years. And if you walk away needing to call your mother, your partner, your friend, to say I see you, well, that's the film doing its work. I'll close with this: if you're drawn to stories where the path to truth is not a straight line but a maze, where getting lost is the only way to be met, and if you don't mind carrying some of that weight with you after the credits, then make time for this one. Bring your heart, bring your patience, and let the film take your hand. So since you said yes and you're still here with me, let's slip right back into the world of Tersesat Untuk Dipertemukan, because there's still so much in this film that we haven't really touched, and the longer I sit with it, the more I realize how cleverly it layers its drama, how it turns what could have been a simple sob story into this dense emotional maze you keep thinking about long after the credits roll. And maybe that's the perfect place to start this second part, not with the big plot turns we already walked through, but with the small details at the beginning that quietly set everything in motion, because when you rewatch the opening 15 minutes, it's almost like the film was whispering its themes from the very first frame. We just didn't know how to listen yet. Remember that very first image, Amel standing at the edge of her husband's hospital bed, the room bathed in that cold, institutional blue, her figure half silhouetted against the window, and the camera doesn't rush in, it hangs back, giving us a slightly distant, almost voyeuristic view, like we're a stranger passing by in the corridor, catching a glimpse of this tiny pocket of private pain in the middle of a busy, In different building, we hear the low murmur of other people outside, the wheels of a gurney squeaking, a child crying somewhere, the elevator dinging, and over it all, the steady beep of the heart monitor next to Ranga's bed, and the way the sound mix is done there is brilliant. Because they don't drown us in the monitor, they set it slightly off to the side, just piercing enough that we're always aware of it without being hypnotized by it, like the constant reminder that time is still moving even for someone who looks frozen. The script smartly doesn't give us exposition right away. Nobody comes in and explains in neat dialogue what happened to Ranga, how long he's been in a coma, what Amel's situation is. Instead, we learn through behavior, through objects, through those small, human gestures. There's this moment where Amel pulls a folded, half-torn insurance form out of her bag, smoothing it out on the bedside table. The edge is already softened from being handled too much, and next to it, there's a cheap plastic lunchbox containing home-cooked food that's gone cold, untouched because she spent longer than expected talking to a nurse about payment deadlines. That's all we need to know right then. This is a woman scrambling, juggling love and money and hope and paperwork, and she's losing ground on all fronts. It's only as the early scenes unspool, her commute on a crowded bus, the way she holds Naya's little hand while navigating noisy streets, that slightly too bright smile she gives the landlady when she says the rent will definitely be there next week, that the shape of her life comes into focus. And what I love is that the film doesn't portray her poverty as some exotic misery porn. It's matter-of-fact, textured with small comforts and routines. She has neighbors who say hi, a little food stall she frequents where the seller slips an extra piece of tofu into her bag for Naya, a second-hand TV that flickers in and out of reception, and in those early, quiet scenes, before the Haleem family storms into her narrative like a tidal wave, you really feel what's at stake, not just emotionally but practically, because when we later reach the scenes in the Haleem mansion, every shiny surface is measured against that cramped rented room and the hours on the bus, and you understand exactly why the offer to move in feels both like salvation and a threat. The film also plants the seeds of Ranga's double identity early, in such a subtle way you only catch it on a second viewing. There's this shot of a framed photo beside the hospital bed, the classic smiling couple pose, Amel and Ranga on their wedding day, except if you look closely, the way it's shot and the way the light hits the glass, Ranga's face is partially obscured by reflection, while Amel's remains fully clear. And at first you might write that off as just an aesthetic choice, but later, when we know that the name, Ranga, is layered over Adi Haleem, that reflection feels like a clue, a visual metaphor. The man she thinks she knows is already half covered, half revealed, and she just doesn't realize it yet. Another detail I really appreciate is how the film uses flashbacks, not as full-blown expository sequences, but as quick, almost involuntary memory fragments that intrude on Amel's present, like there's a moment in the hospital cafeteria where she's waiting in line to buy the cheapest coffee they have, and as she taps her fingers on the plastic tray, the image cuts, just for a second, to her and Ranga years earlier, doing the same tapping game on a street food stall table, laughing about something silly, the camera catching the way his face lights up around her, and then we're slingshot back to the present. Same gesture, completely different emotional context. And it's in those flashes that we slowly build our own version of Ranga, the man, before the film starts pulling that version apart. What's fascinating is how ordinary he seems in these glimpses. He shares cheap meals with her, jokes about winning the lottery, complains about his boss, promises they'll move into a better place one day. There's no ominous shadow trailing behind him in those early flashbacks, no clear sign that he's running from something, and that's smart writing, because it means that when we later discover his ties to the Haleem family and the identity forgery, we feel as blindsided as Amel does, and we're forced into the uncomfortable position of holding two truths at once, that he was, to her, a loving husband, and that he was also a man carrying a much larger, messier history he never shared. Now, when we talk about the identity reveal, we often jump straight to the DNA test scene, but there's a smaller, quieter moment that I think is even more heartbreaking. And it happens earlier. When Amel is first asked to bring his official documents, the camera follows her back to their room, and we watch her pull out that little metal tin she keeps under their thin mattress, the place where she stores all the important things, her marriage certificate, Naya's birth certificate, Ranga's ID card, a few old receipts, some passport photos, and she handles each item with this reverence, like they're not just papers, but the fragile scaffolding of the life she's built. And as she takes out Ranga's ID and looks at his face there, printed and clear. And if you want me to cover more about specific scenes, the way the rainstorm sequence is constructed, the storytelling choice behind the final conversation between Amel and the matriarch, or even dive deeper into how the film's sound design turns hospital machinery into a heartbeat that doubles as a ticking clock. I'm ready to go there with you, because this one deserves to be talked about, not just watched. So, are you in? Are you ready to keep wandering so we can meet the next layer of this film together? You ready to see how cinema can make paper, breath, and love into weapons and shields at the same time? Match over tea. Dina ushers Amel into a smaller sitting room, away from Pak Haleem, and she starts, at first, with polite small talk, asking about how long Amel and Ranga have been married, what kind of work he did, how they met, and Amel, still trying to be respectful and grateful, answers as calmly as she can, but there's a tension thrumming under every exchange, because both women are asserting a kind of claim over the same man, and the turning point is when Dina asks for wedding photos. I'd like to see, she says, with a tight smile, and Amel pulls out her phone, scrolling through, finding the pictures that mean everything to her, and as they look at them together, the camera shows the screen reflected in a glass cabinet door, so we see these ghosts of images, layered over fine china and heirlooms, and Dina's voice breaks just a little as she whispers, "He should have been here, getting married in this house, with all of us. Why didn't he tell us about you?" And there's no answer Amel can give that would satisfy that pain, because she doesn't have one, and so the scene just hangs there, in that unresolved ache, sowing the seeds for the slow, grudging bond that will come later. When the kidnapping happens, it's made all the more chilling by how thoroughly we've settled into the rhythms of this uneasy new household. We've had time to see Naya start to adapt, to watch her run through the enormous hallways with a mix of delight and confusion, to see how the staff dote on her, how she shyly tests the boundaries of this new world. One scene that stands out before the abduction is when a new nanny is introduced, a woman named Sari, who is presented to Amel as someone hired to help you rest, and it's clear from the jump that Amel doesn't fully trust this, but she's worn down, exhausted, and in those moments when she dozes off in a chair by Ranga's bed, we see Sari taking Naya to the garden, playing with her, slowly becoming part of her small, fragile circle of security. The film sprinkles in warning signs, a lingering shot of Sari's phone with messages popping up that she quickly hides, the way she sometimes seems more interested in watching the gates than in playing with the child, but it never screams, "Villain," at us, and that's what makes the actual kidnapping so disturbing, because it feels plausible, not like some elaborate movie set piece. They choose a day when the house is busier than usual, relatives coming and going, lawyers meeting with Pak Haleem. Amel pulled into a discussion about signing some temporary guardianship forms, for the sake of convenience, and during that little legal ambush, while she's sitting in an office with papers in front of her, pen hovering above the dotted line, Sari gets the green light from her co-conspirators, and within minutes, Naya is led out of a side gate, into a car that looks just like one of the Haleem's vehicles, and driven away into the city. The moment Amel realizes her daughter is missing is horrible, not because of violence, but because of silence. She steps out of the office, ears still ringing from legal jargon she barely understood, and she does what she always does, looks for Naya, calls her name casually at first, expecting the usual giggle or patter of feet, and instead there's nothing, just the echo of her own voice bouncing off the marble. She checks the garden, the playroom, asks the maids, who turn from confused to alarmed in seconds, and the shift in everyone's demeanor is captured in this brilliant shot from above, looking down as the peaceful, slow movements of people in the house suddenly start intersecting and speeding up, like ants whose nest has been kicked. The aftermath of the kidnapping is where the film really tests every relationship it's built up so far, because fear strips away politeness. It makes everyone say the quiet parts out loud. At the police station, one of the officers, trying to piece things together, asks whether there have been any family disputes, any custody questions, any legal irregularities, and in front of Amel, Pak Haleem, frustrated and distraught, snaps, "The only irregularity is that my son was living under a false name with a woman we knew nothing about," and you can practically see those words hit Amel like physical blows. She's standing there, clutching a crumpled missing child flyer, and suddenly, in that one sentence, she's been reduced to a footnote in their family narrative, and regularity, and the camera lingers on her face as she processes not just the loss of her daughter, but the way her role in this entire tragedy is being reframed, as if she's partly to blame simply for existing in a story that was never supposed to have room for her. This is what pushes her, weeks later, to take matters into her own hands when she gets that anonymous text we talked about earlier. That warehouse rescue sequence isn't about action choreography, It's about her finally refusing to be the most reasonable person in the room, the one who sits and waits while men in suits talk, and it's one of the rare times the film lets the camera get chaotic, handheld, jittery, matching her panic as she navigates that shadowy industrial area, calling Naya's name into the echoing darkness, and the heartbreaking thing is that she actually hears her. She hears her daughter whimpering in some far-off room, and that sound propels her forward, around corners, upstairs, until she reaches a locked door and starts pounding on it, screaming, and for a second we cut inside. We see Naya on the other side, small and terrified but trying to crawl towards the noise, and then harsh hands grab her and drag her back, and the door remains closed, so by the time the authorities descend, tipped off by the same anonymous source who texted Amel, the kidnappers have evacuated, leaving behind only traces, rope burns on a bed frame, empty water bottles, a cheap stuffed toy with one eye missing, and the film stays with Amel as she realizes she was seconds away, maybe a single locked door away, from saving her child, and yet somehow that isn't what happened, and it's in her exhausted collapse outside that building that something shifts in the Haleems, because witnessing her willing to walk into such obvious danger without any guarantee of backup forces them to confront a version of motherhood that isn't sanitized, isn't strategic, but raw and primal and self-destructive, and that becomes a turning point. For Dina especially. From that point on, Dina starts actively siding with Amel in family discussions, pushing back when older relatives question her decisions, quietly giving her inside information about what the lawyers are planning, and we get that beautiful late-night kitchen scene where the ice truly breaks between them, the one I mentioned before but want to revisit now because it's so carefully written. The two of them sit at the counter. The only light coming from the range hood, everything else in the house dark and quiet, and instead of talking about Ranga or legal strategies, they start swapping memories, little stories about their childhoods, and slowly, reluctantly, about him. Dina admits that when her brother left, she told herself this story that he was happy elsewhere, that maybe he needed to be far away from their father's expectations, that he'd found someone who loved him without all the baggage of the Haleem name. And when she realized that someone might be Amel, and that they had a child together, part of her was jealous, not in a romantic sense, but in the sense of, you got the version of him that I was never allowed to have, and Amel, instead of reacting defensively, shares her own version, the fights, the money troubles, the times he came home late and wouldn't say where he'd been, the way she sometimes felt like he was carrying a weight he refused to put into words, and it's through this exchange that the movie quietly reframes Ranga, Adi not as the axis of their conflict, but as a shared absence, a missing piece in both their lives, and that recognition of common loss is what allows them to stand together when things get uglier later. And make no mistake, the film doesn't pretend that just because the women find solidarity, the systems around them magically become just. The legal machinery keeps grinding on, and the investigation into the identity forgery unearths increasingly ugly truths. We learn, for instance, that when Adi first disappeared, there were business partners and possibly criminal associates who had a vested interest in him staying gone, and those same networks are tied to the document-falsifying ring that gave him the name, Ranga. It's implied, subtly, through a police briefing and a single confrontational visit from an old associate to the hospital, that he may have been both a user and a victim of that system, that he might have initially wanted to disappear but then found himself unable to fully return, trapped between the person he was born as and the one he'd become. That ambiguity is one of the things that gives the film its adult edge, because we never get the comfort of a clear moral reading of his choices, and because he never wakes up to explain himself, we're left only with interpretations, and that, in turn, forces the other characters to define their futures based not on his guidance, but on their own values. Thematically, this ties into the title so beautifully, Tersesat Untuk Dipertemukan, lost to be brought together, because it isn't just talking about physical lostness, like Naya being kidnapped or Adi disappearing. It's about moral, emotional disorientation, characters getting so turned around by grief, guilt, and longing that the only way through is to stumble, to admit they don't know what they're doing, and in that stumbling, find other people who are just as lost, and that shared lostness becomes the beginning of a real connection. You see this in Amel's arc most clearly. She starts the film acting out of a kind of single-thread devotion. Everything is about her husband's recovery, her sacrifices, her hours in that hospital room. But by the final act, she's had to let that thread fray in order to protect her daughter and herself. And that's something the movie treats not as a failure of loyalty, but as a hard-earned growth. There's a beautifully written monologue she has near the end. Sitting outside the hospital on a bench, talking to Dina, where she says something along the lines of, "I used to think that loving someone meant never letting go, no matter what, but now I think sometimes it means holding on to yourself too, so you're not completely empty if they never come back." And the way the actress delivers that, no big sob, just this weary, reflective tone, makes it feel like a thesis statement not just for her character, but for the film. Now, stylistically, I want to highlight how all these emotional arcs are supported by the film's visual and sonic language, because for a story that's so heavily rooted in talk, conversations in rooms, negotiations, arguments, it never feels static, partly because the director is constantly framing people in relation to spaces that either constrain or liberate them. Think about the corridors again. In the hospital, the corridors are long, sterile, lined with identical doors, and Amel always seems slightly small in them, often placed at the far end of the frame, moving towards us or away from us, like a figure in a maze. In the Haleem mansion, the corridors are wider, warmer in tone, but they are also emptier, and the camera sometimes tracks behind her as she walks, emphasizing how alone she feels in a place that should, by all appearances, be full of comfort. Then in the warehouse scene, the corridors shift to industrial, harshly lit spaces with exposed pipes and peeling paint. And here the camera becomes more frantic, suggesting not just physical danger but emotional overload. And when you put all these corridor scenes together, you start to see the film's visual metaphor for the journeys the characters are on. They are always moving through in-between spaces, never quite arriving at a room that offers real safety, at least not until those rare, hard-won moments in the final stretch. Color plays its part too. The hospital scenes are dominated by cool blues and whites, the mansion by golds and deep browns, the criminal underworld by sickly greens and neon splashes, and Amel is often dressed in soft, muted tones, faded pinks, light grays, colors that make her almost blend into whichever background she's in, emphasizing her status as someone who adapts, who makes herself small to survive. There are a couple of crucial scenes where the costume design flips that, though, like the day she goes to the warehouse, where she wears a plain but striking red jacket, something we haven't seen on her before, and that red becomes a kind of beacon in those dim, dangerous spaces, a visual manifestation of her urgency and newfound willingness to be seen, even in risk. Sound design is another unsung hero here, and I don't just mean the score, which we already talked about feeling understated and effective, but the way everyday sounds are elevated to emotional cues. In the hospital, the beeping of monitors, the hiss of oxygen, the soft squeak of nurses' shoes on linoleum, these become almost like a lullaby of despair, a soundscape of waiting. In the mansion, you get the soft clink of cutlery on porcelain, the muted hum of an air conditioner, the distant splash of a fountain in the garden, sounds of wealth that, in this context, start to feel eerie because they are so disconnected from the storm raging inside the characters. And then in the grittier urban scenes, like when Amel rides public transport or wanders the streets putting up missing posters, you're hit with honking horns, overlapping street vendors' calls, motorbikes revving, the whole chaotic orchestra of city life that goes on, indifferent to her private catastrophe. And that indifference is key. It grounds the drama, reminding us that for every Amel, there are countless others whose heartbreaks don't make headlines, whose children go missing without a powerful family and a hospital and a TV-friendly story to amplify the search. And that's part of why the movie hit such a nerve with audiences, especially online. A lot of viewers talked about seeing echoes of real news stories in the film, cases of missing children, of hospitals refusing care without payment, of families disputing custody based on who has the right surname, and the film taps into that anxiety without feeling like it's exploiting it. It shows us the bureaucracy, the forms, the cops juggling too many cases, the social workers who are well-meaning but overloaded, and within that system, someone like Amel is at a clear disadvantage, unless she attaches herself to a family like the Haleems, and even then, as we see, protection comes with strings attached. One of the most chilling undercurrents in the movie is how often institutions talk about Naya and Ranga as if they are assets, not people. Their care is always attached to conditions, signatures, payments, proof of identity, and there's this bitter irony in the fact that the only time Naya is seen as unequivocally precious and irreplaceable is when she's missing, when suddenly everyone is scrambling, offering rewards, calling in favors, whereas before, she was occasionally treated as a complication in adult negotiations, an afterthought when lawyers discussed liabilities and claims. This is why the reunion scene at the police station feels so cathartic despite its subdued tone, because in that moment, for Amel, all the talk falls away, the lawyers, the the documents, the questions of inheritance and guardianship, none of that matters when she sees her daughter sitting there in an oversized hoodie, eyes swollen from crying, little legs swinging nervously off the bench, and the way the film stages. That moment is so gentle, it doesn't drag us through a long explanation of how the cops finally found her. We get a brief, almost throwaway line about a raid, a tip-off, some criminals arrested, and that's it. That narrative thread is effectively closed, because the real story the film cares about is the emotional thread between mother and child, that moment of eye contact across the room. The way Naya's face shifts from disbelief to recognition to this almost painful relief, like water flooding back into dried-out ground, and when they embrace, it's not big and theatrical, it's tight and desperate, like they're both afraid that if they loosen their grip, the other might vanish again. In the aftermath of that reunion, the film slows down, giving us space to see how everybody reacts to the fact that Naya is back and the immediate crisis is over, but the deeper issues remain. Haleem, for instance, is visibly shaken, not just by the kidnapping itself, but by the realization that his attempt to reclaim his son and exert control over his proper family has nearly cost the life of an innocent granddaughter, and there's a key scene where he visits Ranga's hospital room alone, for the first time really alone with him without Amel or Dina present. He sits down, his posture heavy, and he starts talking, not in the reproachful tone he used earlier when reminiscing about Ardi's mistakes, but in this broken, reflective way, admitting his own failures, his stubbornness. The way he pushed his son into a mold, and how all of that stubbornness cascaded into this nightmare. And this monologue is particularly powerful because it's essentially a confession without a priest, a plea for forgiveness to a man who can't answer, and yet in speaking these words, he begins to shift, to step back from seeing everything through the lens of ownership and bloodline. It's part of what leads him to make the decision that shapes the film's quiet resolution. He tells Amel, in a later conversation, that regardless of what the law says, he will not contest her guardianship of Naya, that he will support them, financially if they allow, but he will not attempt to legally absorb the child into his household as a Haleem heir against Amel's will, and the way he phrases it is telling. He says something like, "I wanted to fix what I broke, but I forgot that you were already doing that, long before I knew you existed." And in that line, you can feel him finally acknowledging her. Not as a temporary inconvenience, not as the other woman, but as the person who has actually done the work of loving his son and raising his granddaughter. Dina's growth culminates in a similar act of humility and courage. She sits with Naya at one point, coloring together, and she tells her, gently, that she can call her Aunt Dina if she wants, but she doesn't have to. She acknowledges that she's late to this child's life, that there are inside jokes she doesn't get, stories she wasn't there for, and instead of trying to force a bond based on blood, she offers one based on presence going forward. "I can't be in your old memories," she says, "but if you let me, I'd like to be in your new ones." And for me, that was one of the most moving lines in the film, because it encapsulates the idea that family is something you build, not something that's automatically owed just because of genetics. By the time we get to that final finger twitch on Ranga's bed, the possible hint of awakening, it almost doesn't matter what happens next with him, and that's such an interesting inversion of what you might expect from a story that starts with a man in a coma. In so many films, the entire emotional arc would hinge on whether he survives, whether he opens his eyes and remembers everything, but here, the emotional climax happens without his participation, and the potential of his return is framed not as a magical fix, but as another complicated chapter, something that could heal or reopen wounds, and that's why the director wisely cuts away after that tiny movement, leaving us in a state of uncertainty that mirrors life, because in reality, people don't just wake up from comas and deliver perfect speeches that tie up every loose end. They wake up confused, sometimes never, sometimes half awake in ways that are devastating, and to leave that thread dangling is the film's way of respecting how messy these stories really are. It says, what matters most has already happened. The living made choices in the face of not knowing, and they chose, by and large, compassion. Now, if we're being completely honest, the movie isn't without flaws, and it's worth touching on those too, because loving a film doesn't mean pretending it's perfect. Some viewers have pointed out, and I think fairly, that the criminal side of the plot, the identity forging ring, the kidnappers, the off-screen raid, feels underwritten compared to the rich emotional detail given to the family drama. We don't really get a clear sense of who the main antagonist is in that world. There's no single face of the bad guy, and while hack can be seen as a realistic portrayal of systemic crime. It also makes certain payoffs feel a bit distant, like when we're told there have been arrests. It's slightly abstract. We're relieved because Naya is safe, but we don't feel any particular catharsis about the network being dismantled. Another critique is about pacing. Some would say that the middle portion of the film, between the DNA reveal and the kidnapping, lingers too long on the slow-building tension in the Haleem household. Repeating certain beats of uneasiness, awkward dinners, side glances, and while those repetitions deepened the sense of class and emotional friction for me, I can see how someone less invested in that texture might get impatient, wanting the plot to move faster. And then there's the occasional contrivance. You could argue, for instance, that the anonymous text with Naya's location is a bit too convenient, or that the police, who are initially shown as overworked and somewhat skeptical, become suddenly more competent when the plot needs them to. But to the film's credit, those moments never fully break its emotional realism. They are bumps in a road that's otherwise impressively grounded, and the strength of the performances, especially from the core trio of Amel, Dina, and Pak Haleem, is powerful enough to carry you over those bumps. Something I find really compelling is how this movie fits into a broader wave of melodramatic yet socially aware storytelling in the 2020s, especially in Asian cinema. You can absolutely feel echoes of Korean, makjang, dramas, the high-stakes family secrets, comas, rich versus poor tensions, kidnappings, but Tersesat Untuk Dipertemukan never quite tips into the heightened, almost operatic exaggeration those shows sometimes embrace. It keeps one foot firmly in a more grounded, slice-of-life reality, closer to what you might see in certain Indonesian sinetron that have decided to mature beyond pure formula, and that hybrid tone, high drama blended with believable emotion, is part of what makes it so unique. It's also very distinctly Indonesian in its social details, even if it doesn't always spell them out. The way the film portrays paperwork as both a lifeline and a trap reflects a whole real-world conversation about how citizens interact with state systems, KTPs, birth certificates, BPJS insurance, and how, for people on the margins, a missing stamp or a mismatched name can mean being denied care, denied rights, and having to jump through endless hoops just to prove you exist. And in that sense, the identity forgery plot isn't just a thriller device, it's a commentary on how fragile the concept of official identity can be, especially in societies where bureaucracy is powerful but not always accessible or fair. The film's spiritual dimension is subtle but present too. You see it in how characters talk about takdir, fate, as both comfort and cage. Early on, when the doctors hint that Ranga might never wake up, someone says, "We leave it to God." And that line is both an expression of faith and, arguably, a way of not taking responsibility for hard decisions. But by the end, when Amel talks about holding on to herself, when Pak Haleem takes responsibility for the choices he made, there's a quiet shift from pure resignation to active, ethical choice-making, and that tension between, this is fate, and, this is on us, is something that resonates in many cultures, but especially in places where religion and fatalism are woven deeply into everyday language. Audience reactions to these aspects have been fascinating. People have written long posts dissecting that dynamic, some praising the film for honoring faith while still challenging fatalistic misuse, others wishing it had leaned even more into spiritual themes, perhaps showing more of the community, the role of local religious leaders. But honestly, I think the restrained approach works, because it allows viewers to project their own beliefs onto the story, to see, in Amel's resilience, whatever combination of faith and sheer human stubbornness speaks most to them, and beyond all the analysis, beyond the socio-political layers, there's something very simple and very universal at the heart of Tersesat Untuk Dipertemukan, the fear of losing the people we love and the equally profound fear of not really knowing them. So many of us go through life assuming we know who our partners, parents, or children are, based on the roles they play in our personal stories, and this film pokes at that assumption, gently but persistently, asking, what would you do if a document, a test, or a stranger's claim suddenly told you that the person you built your life around has an entirely different name, history, family, and set of obligations you knew nothing about? Would that invalidate the memories you made together, or would it simply complicate them? And do you even want the answers to those questions, or is there mercy in not knowing, in deciding that the person you loved in your kitchen, in your bed, in your cramped rented room, is the only version that matters? Regardless of what's printed on some official file, in the end, Tersesat Untuk Dipertemukan doesn't tell you what to think, it just lives with these questions, breathes them, and passes them on to you, like a quiet ache in your chest as you leave the theater or switch off your screen. you carry Amel's tired, determined eyes with you, her willingness to walk into danger, her decision to redefine what survival looks like, not as waiting passively for a man to wake up, but as actively protecting the fragile little world she has with her daughter and, somehow, carving out a space in the complex, guilt-ridden, but ultimately evolving Haleem family. So if you've come with me through all of this, through the hospital corridors and mansion hallways and dark warehouses and quiet kitchen confessions, through identity papers and missing posters and whispered apologies to people who might never hear them, then you already know why this film deserves to be talked about at length, why it earned more than just a quick thumbs up or thumbs down, because it's not just a story you watch once and forget, it's one that sits with you, tapping gently on the door of your own memories, your own fears about love, loss, and how well you really know the people sleeping under the same roof as you. And if you're still hungry for more character analysis, more scene breakdowns, more thoughts about how this film might ripple into future projects in the region, or how it could be remade or expanded as a series, well, then I'm going to leave you with the same question this review left hanging at the end of the last part, because that's our little ritual now. So let's pull the thread even tighter, because the strange magic of Tersesat Untuk Dipertemukan is that the closer you get to its quiet choices, the louder they echo, and if the first pass through this story felt like a handheld lantern guiding you through dim hallways of grief and doubt, this deeper look shows how carefully those hallways were built and how many doors are half open if you dare to push. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. When I say this film earns its weight through the accumulation of small realities, I mean it literally starts at the micro level. Amel's rhythm is broken down into minute acts of care, like stirring porridge until the bubbles stop, nibbling cracked ice for her husband because he can't, pressing her thumb into the corner of a gauze pad to shape it just right, and the camera respects those motions, never snipping past them as fluff but dwelling long enough that you feel time thickening around her. And that thickness is the point. It's the movie's way of telling you endurance is not a word, it's a collection of muscle memory moments. Notice how often frames are anchored by thresholds, doorways, curtains, window grills. Every time Amel crosses one, it's a small victory and also a toll, and the director repeats that image so gently you almost don't clock it until the third act, when the child is missing and every threshold becomes a possible barrier between her and the answer she's dying for. We talked about how the Haleem family enters like gravity instead of lightning, and if you watch their introduction with attention, the first time we see the matriarch, she's shot obliquely, through two panes of glass, as if the film itself is reminding you to beware of reflections and layers, and the patriarch's first gesture isn't a handshake but the careful placement of a pen beside a stack of papers, a move that in any other movie might be nothing but here reads as a prelude to authority. The way someone who is used to being believed prepares a table. Even the Haleem son is framed just off-center, a man whose inheritance of power doesn't quite fit his shoulders, and those framings are character work, not just pretty pictures, telling us who is at home in the architecture of control and who is visiting. There's a dinner scene in their house that I keep coming back to, modestly staged but packed with electricity, where the conversation about help is couched in terms of gratitude and family duty, and the matriarch smiles sadly while the patriarch keeps asking gentle questions that happen to be precise: dates, names, a hospital's floor number, and Amel answers with modesty, avoiding eye contact at first, and then she looks up, just once, and in that look is the show's thesis. She knows what is being asked, and she knows there will be a cost, and she is weighing survival against the price of being adopted by a narrative that might not be hers, the identity crisis that wakes up in those rooms is not just about the husband's name, it's about the story of their marriage, and to the film's credit it never turns that story into a courtroom exhibit. It lets it live in flashes and textures, a torn bus ticket with a doodle on the back, a snapshot with a finger blocking the lens, a message saved on a cheap phone that opens with "sayang" and stops after 7 seconds because the battery died. And those glimpses are enough to convince us the love was real, which makes the possible fraud or confusion around paperwork even more painful. When the police declare there's a discrepancy between the man's national ID and the hospital records, the film doesn't jump to dramatic pronouncements. It sends Amel into rooms where the machinery of bureaucracy wheezes like a second ventilator, and we watch her learn the choreography of desks and stamps, the geometry of lines, and we watch how kindness sneaks through anyway. Someone tells her the closed window can be a little open if she comes back at 2. Someone whispers the name of a clerk who is less rigid on Wednesdays, and the human map of the city is drawn in favors as much as in streets. I keep saying this, but it matters, The film's suspense grows not from grand conspiracies but from the way ordinary systems are built to care for bodies while ignoring souls, and sometimes that error creates enough shadow for a bad choice to hide. The kidnapping, the disappearance, if you want to soften the word, arrives like a gut punch precisely because the movie refuses to gild it. It's midday, a normal errand, a phone call that pulls attention a few degrees off the child, a side street without a working camera, and suddenly the frame empties where a small backpack used to be, and the sound drops to a low thrum that makes your heart beat too loud in your own ears. And no, the movie doesn't revel in cruelty, it cuts away from the snatch itself, but it leaves us with the aftermath, with a Mel sprint that becomes a stumble that becomes a frozen shaking as her brain catches up, and then the voice, someone on the line, controlled, not theatrical, laying down terms that are not even fully about money, they're about silence and compliance and the end to questions about the man in the bed. And that is what collapses the narrative into its third gear, because we realize the threats have been braided all along: identity, power, and now the most basic animal fear of losing a child. What I admire here is how the movie keeps the child present as a person even when he's off screen, his dinosaur drawing taped to a cupboard, the way he always leaves one sleeve rolled up, a song he hummed that becomes a breadcrumb in a crucial moment later, because the film refuses to reduce him to a prop even for suspense. And yes, Mel's response isn't to wait for heroes, she builds a net from the people the movies usually forget, and this portion sings with a kind of hush hymn of community: an uncle who runs a coffee stall and knows every motorbike plate on his block, a lab tech who knows the difference between a fresh photocopy and one made last year by the shade of the ink, the janitor who watches monitors at night and notices when a camera blinks, the security guard at the Haleem gate who understands that sometimes loyalty is not to a name on a paycheck but to the person in front of you whose eyes won't stop shaking. It's thrilling the way the film stages these micro-strategies, not as a montage of fake competence, but as a series of human negotiations where courage is awkward and help is clumsy and still, somehow, effective. And when I talk about style, this is where the direction's humility becomes a weapon. The camera will sit, will watch a phone on a table while we listen to breathing, will track the edge of a raincoat as it brushes a wall, and those choices slow the world so that when action finally cracks open, you are fully inside it. Let's talk about that rainstorm sequence because it's quietly one of the best set pieces I've seen in a while. Not because of edit pyrotechnics but because of sound and geography. Amel is led to an open-air parking area behind a mall as a storm rolls in, and the first drops ping like tiny nails, voices skip and smear in the wet air, and she has to discern one voice that matters through the static, and the film holds her in a wide frame that makes her small but not powerless, and then the camera slides to show the edges of a setup that could be a trap, and you are pleading with the frame to show you more while also worrying that seeing more will confirm your worst fear. It's all engineered to tighten your throat, and it works because the prior hour taught you how rain sounds in this universe, how metal rings, how phones hiss, how a parked car filled with condensation becomes a mirror for your anxiety, and when the move happens, the pivot that changes the rescue path, the film resists the cliché of shady men unveiling guns. It leans into improvised courage, spilled groceries becoming an alarm, a scooter's horn becoming a beacon, someone's rain-slicked hand slipping and turning a near disaster into a fragile opening, and the very ordinariness of those tools is what makes the triumph feel owned by the characters rather than granted by the script. Performances remain the anchor in this stretch. The actor playing the matriarch has a late scene in which she tries to apologize without admitting fault, and it's a masterclass in the language of power, every word a gift that returns to its giver, and when she finally drops the veil, even by a centimeter, you see the years of fear that made her into an expert at well-meaning control, and it's impossible to hate her, which is precisely why the moral knot stays tangled. The patriarch's controlled speech patterns never collapse into caricature either. His brand of decency is code for order, and watching him bump into the limits of that order in the face of Amel's raw clarity is oddly moving. As for the son, the delayed courage arc avoids the hero spotlight and instead finds heroism in the willingness to contradict a father in public, and it comes down to a quiet line delivered as if it might break his teeth, and that's the kind of scene that leaves a mark not because of volume but because of the cost. If we zoom further into the craft, color work is doing heavy lifting. You feel even if you don't clock it. Notice the hospital's cold white slowly warming across the runtime, as if Amel's stubborn tenderness burns warmth into sterile spaces, while the Haleem house drifts from warm lamplight to colder glassy blues as their confidence starts to chip. It's a reversal that mirrors the power exchange without ever shouting. Wardrobe has its own story too. Amel's muted, washable fabrics against the Haleem's curated ease, and somewhere in the middle stretch there's a scarf exchange, a small thing, a loan for a chilly lobby, that becomes a carrier for guilt and gratitude later. And the director quietly returns to that scarf in the end as an emblem of what can be shared without ownership. Editing is invisibly elegant, especially in how it transitions between past and present without fireworks. A spoon scraping a bowl becomes the squeal of a gate, a child's laugh crossfades into the chirp of a machine, and these sound bridges keep memory living in the same air as the now, reminding us that grief is not a flashback but a constant overlay. If you're a fan of formal bravura, you might wish for flashier moments, but I found the restraint bracing, like a promise that the film won't lie to you with tricks. On the theme side, the more I sit with it, the more the movie feels like a study of consent. Consent to be helped, to be named, to be forgiven, and how often our yeses are coerced by structure, not people. When Amel signs a document at one point, the scene is staged like a sacrament and a surrender all at once, the pen heavy, the paper too bright, and the very act of writing her name looks like a fight not to be erased by the lines of text that will define her for men in offices she'll never see. This is where the film walks a razor between anger at systems and empathy for those inside them, and it never turns into a pamphlet because it's too in love with actual humans, with flaws and contradictions and tiny rebellions, like the clerk who stamps the wrong form on purpose because the wrong form is softer on the person in front of her. If it sounds like everyone is just good, they are not. There are people here who cash in on confusion. An identity fixer whose tone is almost friendly while he sells shortcuts that end up costing more than the long road, and the actor plays him with the right mix of pride and insecurity, which is worse because you can smell the rationalizations he uses to sleep. I mentioned earlier the choice to let the husband, even in coma, be more than a device, and the way the film does this is subtle. There's a moment where a nurse reads aloud to him from a sports page while Amel steps out, and the words don't matter as much as the shared air, the idea that life keeps happening inside him even as the world debates his name. And when the movie finally offers a crucial answer about who he is, not the full dossier, but the moral truth of it, it's delivered not with a reveal but with a relinquishing, a decision to stop holding a line that should never have been drawn, and that pivot is as close to grace as the movie allows. Pacing through this lens remains a talking point. The film's front half still risks testing your patience if you come in hungry for twists, but watching a second time, the repetition of certain beats, the ventilator hiss, the shoe removal at a threshold, the polite bow to a guard, reads less like padding and more like ritual, and rituals are how people survive trauma without collapsing. So when the rituals break, Amel runs in shoes, doesn't bow, barges, your body feels the violation like an alarm, and that is clever storytelling through rhythm. Audience conversations around this film have orbited around whether the Haleems are villains or victims of their own myth, and the healthier takeaway, I think, is that the film refuses those binaries on purpose, choosing instead to show how power can be a comfort and a cage, sometimes for the same person, sometimes on the same day, and that patience with complexity is a gift in a movie world that loves clean wins. What about cultural specificity, the way paperwork and family names and hospital logistics function here in an Indonesian context? Yes, the film breathes that air, but it also opens windows for anyone who has ever watched a loved one flatten under the weight of forms, for anyone who has ever had to smile while asking for fairness from someone who could say no just by blinking slower. And if we're talking about the kid, we must mention the tender detail of his vocabulary, the way he mispronounces one word that becomes a code for identification later, and that tiny sound stitched into the score is the kind of decision that shows a team thinking like storytellers rather than manipulators. The score itself rarely tells you how to feel, it underlines fatigue more than fear. It loves to hover at the edge of silence, and when it swells it does so to lift people rather than scenes, which is why the end cascade, where the film chooses aftermath over victory lap, lands like a soft weight instead of a trumpet, and in those final passages, the faces carry the text, a head bowed in relief rather than triumph, a hand touching a doorway as if asking permission to enter a future that will never be spotless, and a quick glance between Amel and the matriarch that says, without a word, we will live with what we did and what we failed to do. If you want the flashy version of this story, it doesn't exist here, and if you want the honest version, that's exactly what this movie keeps offering, scene by careful scene. Now, because this is still a review and not a sermon, is there anything that doesn't sing, anything that might trip you? Yes. A late conversation runs 5 beats longer than it needs to, repeating a point about duty we already understood, and a cutaway to a news headline feels like a borrowed move from a lesser thriller, but those are small shadows on a larger canvas of clean choices, and the overall rhythm of feeling remains intact. For the performance nerds among us, you'll appreciate the way the actors keep their hands busy, ringing, smoothing, tapping, a choreography of nerves that's miles more revealing than a shouted speech, and the director trusts that. There's also a single shot I loved where we watch Amel from behind as she listens to two men debate her life as if she's a case file, and the restraint to not cut to her face until after they stop talking is a bold little grammar choice, reserving her reaction as her own, not a spectacle for their benefit. And when we finally see her eyes, they're not crying, they are calculating, and that shift, from overwhelmed to strategic, is the turn the movie hinges on. I don't want to overlook how funny the film is in tiny, life-affirming ways, because it is. Someone mislabels a Tupperware, a nurse tells a wry joke about coffee, a neighbor's cat refuses to respect property lines, and those little gusts of ordinary air keep the film from drowning you. They remind you what all the hurt is for, life, as it is, imperfect and stubborn. When people ask me if this is a sad movie, I say it's honest, and honesty sometimes carries sadness like a shadow, but it also carries purpose. And if you've got room in your week for purpose, this one is worth the space. In terms of broader impact, this will likely be the kind of film that pops up in group chats where friends swap real stories of mismatched paperwork and hospitals that are somehow both caring and inscrutable, the kind of film that nudges you to check on that person in your life who might be doing too much alone, and if art can make us do that even once, I call that a win. As a piece of cinema, beyond the ethical and emotional heft, it is also a cleanly built machine, no wasted prop, no stray character. Even the umbrella that appears in Act 1 returns as a compromise in Act 3, tiny weatherproofing for a truce, and that attention makes rewatching a pleasure rather than a hunt. If you are here for big takeaways, it's this: the film argues that love is a practice, not a feeling, identity is a fabric, not a tag, and truth, when it finally comes, rarely offers you applause, just the chance to start again with fewer illusions. And that is more precious than neatness. Would I recommend it without caveat? No, the caveat is pace. You must accept the slowness the way you accept rain in the wet season, not as an interruption but as part of the weather of the story. And if you do, the floodplain blooms. The small seeds of detail grow into understanding that would be impossible at a sprint. And if you're still here, still curious, then you're exactly the audience this film trusts. The ones who don't need an explosion to know when a life has detonated, the ones who can sit through silence and hear 10 things speaking at once. I'll leave this segment with one more image that stays with me: a hallway lamp left on in daytime, for no good reason except habit.